Went to Gallipoli twice, I think, in the course of writing the book. Sikh Walk no longer exists. It was a country lane. It's now a field. There's nothing there but the name, and even the name's only on the maps.
And that moment when you talked about that there is a book there talking about Indians in Gallipoli, and then what was that moment for you?
I was already interested in British India, and so I looked into the documents catalogue, the archives. But the danger is that if they start to withdraw, the Turks will attack. And so the evacuation, which occurs with extraordinary success.
As the Indians and the Australians and the New Zealanders mixed up at the Gallipoli campaign, what are other moments of significance during that campaign?
The Indian Mountain Artillery, though, was literally on duty in the observer positions, ready to fire at a moment's notice, and firing their guns every single day.
Could you share some untold stories which you think have not been shared? Welcome, Professor. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Professor Peter, could you please, first of all, before I say anything, it's an honor and it's a privilege to be sitting with you in your company and having this conversation and going through and traversing a long years of history. But before we go to the history part of it, could I ask you to share your background, your backdrop, and your landing into the work you did in the history world?
Sure. Thanks, Dev. It's a very great pleasure to be here with you. I'm a British migrant to Australia. We arrived in 1966, and I grew up in South Australia, a place called Whyalla. I was always interested in history, and as a teenager I read a book. I read many books about history, but one of them was Byron Farwell's Queen Victoria's Little Wars, which was basically about the drama of British Indian military history. And I was entranced by this. It was a very different world to the one I was living in. And I continued to be interested in it even after I became a professional historian. And although I was mostly working as an historian of Australian military history, I always maintained an interest in British India, and in fact did my PhD on British Indian military history in the 19th century. And then when I went to UNSW Canberra, I was basically able to research what I liked, because I was a research professor, so I didn't do much teaching. And what I really was interested in was British India. So I wrote a number of books, several books, 4 books I think, on British India, the military history of the First World War and the 19th century. But the first one I did, I went back to an interest I'd had since the early 1980s, when I first discovered that there were Indian troops on Gallipoli, when I was working at the Australian War Memorial, where I worked for 27 years. And I realised I'd long realised that there was a book to be written about the Indians on Gallipoli, because nobody else had. Extraordinarily, in a century, nobody had written a book about the Indians who served on Gallipoli.
Wow. I want to just dial back on what made you look towards doing your PhD in British India?
I wanted to do a PhD on British India because I wanted to go to India. So I ended up, the PhD of course took 3.5 years, and I went to India once for about 3 weeks. So in some ways it wasn't a very wise decision. I should have just gone for holiday. But I went to places that were related to the subject of the thesis, which was the European troops of the East India Company. So I went to cantonments and churches and cemeteries, basically in North India, what the company called Bengal. And again discovered a fascination for India, and I've been back many times to look at other places, to write other books.
And you have travelled the many headquarters of East India Company in Kolkata, in Mumbai, in Delhi. You would have observed the architecture, and what was your... How is that bringing the history back, the visual of that architecture still being around?
Yeah, that's a really important point, Dev. Last October, I managed to be in Calcutta for my birthday, Kolkata, and I was able to get into Fort William. That was my little birthday present to myself, the courtesy of the Indian High Commission in Canberra. Thank you very much. and I saw Fort William, and that was terrific because I was then able to see a place that I'd only written about before. I'd imagined it, I'd read about it, I'd seen images of it, but I'd never been in it. And I'm a great believer in going to the places where history happened. So to write the Indians on Gallipoli book, I went to Gallipoli twice, I think, in the course of writing the book. And I'd been there before, of course, so I knew my way around. But I think it's really important for historians to get their boots dirty, to look at the place, to experience the place, to see what the climate feels like, for example, and to understand the place as those who served or those who were present knew it. Now, it isn't always possible, because if you go to Gallipoli and you go to a place called Sikh Walk, which is part of the Indian Brigade's lines to the north of Anzac, Sikh Walk no longer exists. It was a country lane, it's now a field. There's nothing there but the name, and even the name's only on the maps. But I think it's important to go to places to experience them, to get a sense of them.
The tangibility of those monuments and the locations, I think that adds value. What's the process of writing history? What kind of mindset you have to have, or what kind of personality trait works very well to deep dive, and it's more tangible, it's not on paper. It comes on paper afterwards. You have to envisage and feel, and you have to use all your 5 senses to come to empathize with the history. So if you elaborate on what kind of a mindset a historian has or should have to elaborate on critical topics.
Well, the first thing is curiosity, because history comes from the Greek word to ask questions. It's about asking questions. The second thing is that it's not fiction, it's not philosophy. You don't dream it up. It's got to be based on evidence, on sources, whether that's the place or whether it's the documents or whether it's oral history. So the ability to find things. Now, in the case of Indians on Gallipoli, the sources are literally all over the world. That I used archives in Australia, in Britain, I went to India, Nepal, and I even found material in New Zealand.
Wow.
So there's material, there's evidence all over the place. Oh, and of course the fieldwork in Turkey. So there's evidence all over the place. And so tenacity is another quality that historians need. They need the ability to say, you need to keep finding stuff, although you also need the discipline to decide that you've found enough and you've got enough to be able to tell the story. But and then of course the discipline to write the story and to complete the process. Because it's not just about research, it's about taking what you've found, transmuting it into something that's usually written, might be in film, sound, but then to make it a document, a story, a program, which people will find interesting and worthwhile and useful.
Very powerful. And that moment when you talked about that there is a book there talking about Indians in Gallipoli, and then what was that moment for you, and then what led to that moment happening and that eureka moment happening for you?
Actually, it happened very early. That when I first started to work at the War Memorial in 1980, I was already interested in British India, and so I looked into the documents catalogue, the archives, and discovered that there was a memoir by an officer called Arthur Ferguson, who was one of the battery commanders of the Indian Mountain Artillery on Gallipoli. And he wrote a very interesting and lively and informative memoir of his battery's time on Gallipoli. And it was when I read that I realised that there was a story that needed to be told here. I actually wrote an article and published it, I think, in 1981. And then it took from 1981 till 2015, when the book came out, to make it happen. But in the meantime, I kept collecting material. I went to London, I happened to be in London, and in the National Archives, there's the war diaries of the Indian units, so I photographed them, and collected stuff along the way. So when it came that I was able to, I had the time and the energy and the resources to write the story, I already had a lot of material gathered up. But the decision to write the book or to research the story happened very early.
Wow. And when did the book started being constructing? So in the early 80s, you started getting the first hint of it, but when did you start constructing your, what you say is the storyline?
Yeah, that happened soon after I started at UNSW Canberra in 2013. I'd already had a relationship with a publisher in Britain called Hellion. They'd published the memoir of a friend of mine, a Welshman who'd served in the West Indies of all places in the 1950s, and had in the meantime sadly gone blind. So I'd helped to transcribe and get his memoir published, and Hellion published it. So I already had a connection with a publisher in Britain that was interested in Indian military history, because the publisher at Hellion was very interested in British India. And so it actually only took one email to Duncan Rogers to say, I know we've published this book about the West Indies, but I've got an idea for a book about Indians on Gallipoli, which no one has ever done before. And we might talk about that, why they haven't. But Duncan was very receptive, and so it came together magically, because I got the job at UNSW as a research professor. I didn't have any other responsibilities. I had the research facilities of the university, and I had a publisher who was actually very interested in the subject.
Wow. Anzac Day is very critical from a point of view of commemorating the Australian and New Zealand forces in Gallipoli. And what's that historical significance of Anzac Day in connection to the Gallipoli and then broadly as well?
Yeah, Anzac Day is intimately connected with the idea of Australian nationhood. Australia Day, the 26th of January, a date that's also of significance in India, of course, but Australia Day has been tainted by the association with the initial British colonisation. Lots of people call it Invasion Day. So Australians have always had an ambiguous relationship with Australia Day. But Anzac Day has always been associated with the idea of Australian nationhood. It's the de facto national day. Why is that so? I think it's because Australia, as you know, federated in 1901, basically as a kind of administrative process. The writing of the Constitution was a very bureaucratic almost process. It was political, but it certainly wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the result of a revolution or a civil war or a war of independence. So Australians, I think, growing up, being in a world that associated the creation of nations with the idea of blood sacrifice. Think of all the nations created in the 19th century. You know, the Germans, the Italians, the nations of Europe that were struggling to assert their own identity. Australians wanted, at the time, an opportunity to sort of feel that they proved themselves as a nation. And the First World War, the Great War, gave them that opportunity. So very early on in the Gallipoli campaign, Australians were saying, this has made us a nation, because they were imbued with that idea of blood sacrifice, that somehow an administrative act by the British Parliament to create the Australian nation wasn't enough. It needed blood, and Gallipoli supplied that blood. I think also, as the Great War ground on and tens of thousands of Australians died, Australians needed to find a justification for all of those deaths. So the idea grew up, especially promoted by people like the historian Charles Bean and the Prime Minister Billy Hughes, that the Australian nation was born on the beaches or the cliffs of Gallipoli.
Wow.
So you get a very close coincidence between Gallipoli and the idea of Australian nationhood. And then, of course, it becomes associated very strongly with the idea of remembering those 60,000 odd dead. And that, of course, becomes entrenched in the Australian calendar and in the Australian mentality. And Australians, although the way they've marked Anzac Day has changed, it's always been an important day, and it's always had a connotation of a connection with national identity.
I want to delve into that, the national identity of Australia. Why is that conversation not that broad or not very well known in terms of understanding that the Gallipoli campaign is a critical piece in the nationalism or the national identity of Australians?
I think it is well understood. I mean, in a sense, Gallipoli overbalances Anzac Day because it began, of course, obviously it commemorates the day on which the Anzacs landed, invaded Gallipoli, but it also commemorates all Australians who died in the Great War, and there were 50,000 more Anzacs who died in the Great War than on Gallipoli, and it also commemorates all those Australians who died in other wars. That's 103,000. So in a sense, the fact that Anzac Day is so closely connected to Gallipoli tends to skew its importance. You know, people always come back to Gallipoli, but they ought to think about the other ways in which war has impinged upon and affected Australia too. And that one day of the year, as they say, gives us the opportunity to do that.
And we are approaching to Anzac Day this year, and then this conversation is to remember and then be part of the Anzac Day conversations which are held across the country, different fashion. During the campaign, the Gallipoli campaign, what are the critical moments you believe, and then historically, are turning points for the campaign?
Yeah. Of course, Gallipoli is a defeat for the invaders. The Australians are part of a force which doesn't succeed It doesn't succeed on the first day. So the day of the landing, in which critical mistakes are made, and there's big arguments among historians about whose fault it is that the landing failed. Some Australians blame British commanders. Some historians blame Australian brigadiers who didn't follow the orders on the morning of the landing. The Ottomans counterattacked and they couldn't get further inland. So the very day of the landing is the first day on which the campaign fails. But it fails on other occasions too. They defend the Anzac perimeter and of course the British enclave at Cape Helles to the south of Anzac. And then the Turks attempt to eject the invaders and they launch a series of massive attacks, especially on the 19th of May. And that fails. So a turning point for the Ottomans, for the Turks, is that they can't evict the invaders. Then in August, the British and the French launch a second big offensive. And that offensive attempts to break through the trench lines and defeat the Turks and advance on Constantinople, which is the aim of the campaign.
Yeah.
And the August offensive, as it's called, also fails at massive cost. Then the last turning point is the evacuation, because in November the British cabinet, especially advised by Lord Kitchener, the British Minister of War, decides that this campaign is failed and it needs to be closed down. But the danger is that if they start to withdraw, the Turks will attack. And so the evacuation, which occurs with extraordinary success, with very few losses, fewer than a dozen men are killed on the day of the evacuation, because the Turks either don't realise that the invaders are leaving, or they do realise the invaders are leaving and they want them just to leave. So there are those points at which the campaign could have ended differently. The landing could have succeeded. The Turks could have driven the invaders off the peninsula. The August offensive could have worked, and the evacuations may have been a failure. But none of those things happened, and so Gallipoli stands as a massive strategic defeat for the Entente powers, for France and Britain. But it's got consequences. One of those consequences is Anzac Day, of course. The other is that parts of the Empire forces that came together actually got to know each other. So Australians and New Zealanders, of course, fought together, but Australians and Indians began to know each other as well. So this military defeat has consequences decades, a century on.
Wow. And then now leading on to the Indian exposure to the Australian Army and the New Zealand Army, and the role of Indian Army or military of different sizes and different forms played in the Gallipoli campaign.
Well, remember that the force that invaded Gallipoli was an Empire force. There was a French force at Cape Helles, there was a British force at Cape Helles, and some of it was at Anzac. At Anzac, which is halfway up the peninsula on the left-hand side, a force of Australians and New Zealanders landed on the 25th of April. But included in that Australian-New Zealand Army Corps was a force of Indian mountain gunners. The Indian Army, of course, fought often on the northwest frontier of India, mountainous country, and it had developed a special expertise in mountain artillery. Light guns carried on mules and operated by Indian gunners commanded by British officers. One of those brigades, that's 2 batteries, a dozen or so guns, was part of the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps. And those guns were critical. They landed on the 25th of April alongside the Australians and New Zealanders. They were posted near the front line and fired at the front line against the Turkish counterattacks that developed from the afternoon of the first day.
Wow.
So right from the beginning of the campaign, Indian gunners and mule drivers were there alongside Anzacs. So that relationship, it actually began a bit earlier than that too, because they'd been in Egypt together and they'd seen each other in Egypt and taken an interest, but not a very close interest because they weren't close, they were physically close. They'd been together in the convoy that was assembled in the harbour at Lemnos on the way over, and Australians would visit the ships, the transports on which the Indian gunners were being carried, and they would talk about the mules and they would see them, and so there was a curiosity already. But from the 25th of April, that curiosity turned into a comradeship because they served together. The Indian artillery observers were in the front line with the Anzacs. The front line was so close to the artillery positions that the front line soldiers could see and hear the guns going off. So there's a very close relationship developed with the Indian gunners right the way through the campaign.
And as they were creating that relationship, and how do you see that relationship being evolved in terms of beyond being companion or colleagues on the war front. How has those relationship evolved? And could you narrate through stories of people as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's a strange relationship and it's an unexpected relationship, because we have to remember that Australia in 1915 was a deeply racist society. One of the very first acts of parliament passed by the Australian government in 1901 was what became the White Australia policy, to exclude persons of colour, Asiatics. And although there was a small Afghan Indian community, basically Cameleers in the outback and Hawkers in the inland, small communities, essentially Indians were not wanted. So you might expect that the Australians who went to Gallipoli would have carried those racist attitudes with them and wouldn't have had anything to do with Indians, or if they did, would have treated them as inferiors. And the strange fact is that they were not only not treated as inferiors, they were respected and admired. So you got the situation where Australians would seek out the Indian gunners' camp and the Indian muleteers who were in the supply and transport units, and mixed with them, communicated with them as best each of them could, because neither could speak the other's language, but they could speak each other's food languages. So the food on Gallipoli for everyone was appalling. The Australians' diet was basically what they called bully beef, which was canned meat and biscuit, very hard biscuit, unpalatable. The Australians would go to the Indian gunners' camps, and what would they have there? The Indians would share their rations with them, because the Indian ration wasn't bully beef and biscuit. It was dal and chapati and spiced, flavoursome, with chutney. So it was much more palatable and digestible than bully beef and biscuit. So you find the Australians hanging around the Indian camps, getting chapatis, smearing them with jam and eating them. And so that there's this friendship develops. Now, one example of this, all Australians know about John Simpson, the British migrant who joined a medical unit and used his donkeys to bring wounded men down from the firing line. He worked this way for about 3 weeks. It's said, and I think truly, that John Simpson set up his camp with the Indian muleteers because they had the food, the water troughs, the ability to feed and care for his animals. So John Simpson, who is known as he's probably the most famous Australian soldier, certainly on Gallipoli, possibly ever, he lived with the Indians for the 3 weeks until on the 19th of May he was shot by either a Turkish machine gun or a Turkish sniper, we don't know which, but he died. So that's an example of the closeness of the relationship that developed between these two groups that you would never have expected would have been friendly, much less respectful.
Are there a few more stories around friendships being created through ex-officials writing stories and then documenting in their own way and form?
Absolutely. Well, I can give several, but here's one. Australians are known to be fairly casual about things like queuing up. You go to a bank in Australia, you can find one. The queue is not a straight line. Australians don't like queuing up. But on Gallipoli, the water shortage was such that they had to line up for the few wells and the few water points where they could be given their daily water ration. Now, one of the wells was near the Indian mountain artillery camp, and a Lance Naik, a Lance Corporal called Sattar Muhammad, was given the job of looking after this well. So he held the handle of the pump. He would fit the handle in, pump the water, and distribute it to the Australians. And the pump, the well was actually in a dangerous place because it was overlooked by Turkish snipers. But Sattar Muhammad, who was an Indian and a Lance Corporal, was given charge of this well, and it was he who said to the Australians who lined up for the water, queue up in order, and I'll call you forward and let you have the water. And his officer, Arthur Ferguson, said that day after day Sattar Muhammad did this, and the Australians, who are not known for their discipline, basically obeyed Sattar Muhammad and did what they were told and lined up and queued up for their water. Now, why was that? Was it because they realised the importance of water discipline? I don't think so. I think what they realised was that Sattar Muhammad was probably in his 30s or even his 40s. Promotion in the old Indian Army was very slow. So a Lance Naik could be in his 30s. He'd certainly been a soldier for at least a decade.
Mm-hmm.
These men had been soldiers for less than a year.
Mm-hmm.
I think they recognised Satar Muhammad as a trained, regular soldier,
Wow.
and they
Mm-hmm.
paid him respect accordingly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's very powerful to respect the experience and respect the honor as well. And as the Indians and the Australians and the New Zealanders mixed up at the Gallipoli campaign, what are other challenges and triumphs which they went through together? What are other moments of significance during that campaign?
Yep. One thing to remember about the mountain artillery is that they were in the front line for the entire campaign.
Mm-hmm.
The infantry battalions were rotated around, so an Australian battalion might spend 3 weeks or even a month in the front line, and then it would be taken back and given a rest.
Mm-hmm.
Now the rest on Gallipoli wasn't much of a rest because it was all under Turkish shell fire, and the water was just as bad and the food was awful and you couldn't get any sleep and the flies were still there. So a rest wasn't really a rest, but at least you weren't in the front line. The Indian Mountain Artillery, though, was literally on duty in the observer positions, ready to fire at a moment's notice, and firing their guns every single day. So the relationship between the two was very close. It also meant that battalion after battalion, as the Australian battalions moved through those trenches, more and more Australians got to know the Indians. Now they didn't get to know them intimately because mostly they couldn't speak Punjabi, the language of the mountain artillery gunners. But the Indians were very adept at learning English. English was the language of command in the Indian Army, so some of the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, the havildars and the Naiks, could speak some English. And both sides developed a kind of a patois, an informal slang. So the Australians would pick up some Indian words, like tourists in India today, where you think you can speak Hindi because you can say hello and good morning and where's the toilet. That was the kind of level of their expertise. But the Indians were more adept at learning English, and so they were able to have conversations. In lots of ways, though, the relationship didn't need language because they recognized qualities in each other. So, for example, the Gurkhas, actually, the biggest example there, there were four and then five Gurkha battalions on Gallipoli. They all had the kukri, the Gurkha knife. And this became an object of fascination to the Australians. And so the Australians, in their diaries and in letters home and in their memoirs, they're forever telling stories about these fearsome little warriors from Nepal who've got these huge knives and what they did with them. And they tell the same story over and over again about a Gurkha who cuts a Turk with a knife. And the Turk says, "Ha, you missed." And the Gurkha says, "Shake your head and see." And of course, he's supposed to have cut his head off.
Yeah.
These stories get relayed again and again and again. So in lots of ways, the Australians are admiring these tall, because Indian soldiers were selected. They were tall, handsome, rugged, experienced regulars. They were almost admiring each other in dumb show. They didn't have to speak. They observed and they commented. And they listened. For example, they didn't just share their food, they listened to the Indian soldiers' songs. So at night in their bivouacs, in their dugouts, the Indians would sing, whatever language it was, whether it was Punjabi, Sikh, whether it was Nepali, who knows. But the Australians and New Zealanders would listen to them singing. So there was this kind of interchange, this cultural meeting in the trenches of Gallipoli.
Wow. If we have to further be more specific within the Indian Army, the role of Sikhs and what kind of armed forces and what kind of support that was provided in the campaign.
The Indian Army was basically organised on ethnic lines. So there were 10 regiments of Gurkhas, for example, 114 odd regiments of Indians, but the Indians, of course, were a whole range of ethnicities, Dogras and Pathans. And Sikhs. Sikhs were very important. Sikhs had been the main ethnic group which had been loyal to the British during the 1857 mutiny. Their martial qualities, their soldierly qualities were recognised by the British. And so the British immediately, once the Sikhs were defeated in 1849, absorbed Sikhs into their British Indian Army. And there were Sikhs in many regiments of the Indian Army. But there were also regiments which were entirely composed of Sikhs. So the 14th Sikhs, the Ferozepur Sikhs, was a battalion of the Indian Army which was entirely Sikh, except for its British officers, of course, and its Parsi medical officer. They were part of the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, and they went to Gallipoli in May 1915, along with 3 other battalions, which I won't go into, but the 14th Sikhs first of all served in Hellas, alongside British regiments. And they were involved in a number of attacks in the Gully Ravine sector at Hellas. Now, Gully Ravine is not a name that's known in Australia, because there were virtually no Australians at Hellas except for a very brief period in May when the 2nd Brigade made an attack. But Gully Ravine became the main area where the Sikhs and the Gurkhas confronted the Turks, the Ottomans. And in June, the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, and especially the 14th Sikhs, made 2 big attacks. The first attack was on the 4th of June, when the 14th Sikhs went over the top and attacked up the gully. Now, this was a foolish thing to do. Their place in the line happened to place them in the bed of the gully, in the floor of this valley. And that meant they were able to be fired on from the Turks who were on the heights on either side of the gully. Yeah. And the 14th Sikhs suffered very, very severely. About 80% of the battalion became killed or wounded in that attack. It virtually crippled the battalion thereafter for about a month, and they didn't take a very big part in the later attack. That was mostly a Gurkha attack. The 4th of June was the moment at which the Sikh battalion was decimated. Now, a number of things happened in this. The first thing was that the loss of so many Sikhs actually stimulated recruiting in the Punjab. Punjab, the Sikhs were especially the most fervent volunteers for the British Indian Army during the Great War, encouraged by their local governments, especially the Maharajas. But the losses at Gully Ravine actually stimulated recruiting. The second thing to notice about the Gully Ravine attack is that the sort of qualities that the Sikhs were renowned for, their tenacity, their bravery, their skill in battle, comes out on the 4th of June. And also that relationship between the British officers and the Sikh sepoys. And there's a famous incident where a very young officer called Reginald Savory, who's only been in the Sikhs for about a year, goes over the top with his men and is wounded, and actually is badly wounded virtually on the Turkish front line. He comes to realise that there are Turks leaning their rifles on him and shooting, using his body as a rest. They're driven off, and one of his sepoys, a Sikh called Udi Singh, comes up, picks Savory up, carries him back to the British lines. Now, this is massive chaos and confusion, and the word that the headquarters gets is that Reginald Savory is dead. So Reginald Savory's family in London get this message to say Reginald's been killed. So for 2 weeks, they're in mourning, they get letters consoling them for the loss of their son. Then Reginald writes them and says, I'm okay, or rather I'm wounded, but I'm okay. Now, the point of the story is that Udi Singh and Reginald Savory enjoyed a bond that went for the rest of their lives. Wow. Reginald Savory actually remained in the Indian Army, remained on Gallipoli, and became the Adjutant General of the Indian Army at independence. And Udi Singh was one of the few men who, if he came to his office in New Delhi, he could walk straight in. And Udi Singh and Savory conducted a good-natured correspondence for the rest of their lives. And so on the day that Reginald Savory died, I think in about 1968, Reginald Savory's widow, of course, wrote to her children or phoned her children to tell them that her father had died. But the next person she told was Udi Singh. Wow. Now, that's a bond.
Yeah, that's a very powerful and impactful story shared within the family, and then probably that linkage.
And it's also been told by both the Savory family and Udi Singh's family. So Udi Singh's son, I think, wrote a booklet about the relationship between the two. So it's one of the very few stories that's actually documented on both the British side and the Indian side.
Wow. Wow. And as we talked about, are there other stories to be told in terms of not just, the stories of honor and war and saving your fellow colleagues and the front line? What are other, beyond that, what are the stories of friendship being evolved?
One of the frustrations of this is that almost none of the Australian evidence refers to a name. So the diaries and letters will say, I saw a Sikh Johnny call them Johnnies. They call them by nicknames. Nobody names anybody. So it's very, very difficult to get into within the Indian units. The only evidence you have is their own officers who wrote about them, who basically their officers thought very highly of them and were forever telling stories about them. So lots of names come through officers' memoirs or officers' letters. They'll tell anecdotes. One day, for example, again, Arthur Ferguson, the mountain artillery captain, says he was sitting in his dugout with the medical officer, having lunch or whatever, and he said a very fire-eating Lance Corporal, burst into his dugout and threw a breech block onto the table. A breech block is the bit where you put the shell into a mountain artillery gun. And the Lance Naik's name was Param Singh. Param Singh says, "Why are you giving us this rubbish? These guns don't work." Well, because they didn't work, because as they were fired hundreds and hundreds of times, the corrosive gases within the breech erodes the seal so that they become less effective. And Param Singh had enough of this, and he actually confronts Arthur Ferguson and says, "What's this rubbish?" Now, he doesn't get punished. It gets explained to him that what can they do? They send guns away. They have to be sent back to India to be repaired, or to Britain to be repaired. But the point is, he tells this story because he's proud of Param Singh's spirit. So you get lots of those sort of stories told by their officers. But otherwise, the Indian names, the personalities don't come through at all, but the Indian names come through in casualty reports where they detail who was wounded and where they were wounded and how severely, and in the citations and recommendations for honours and awards, for decorations. So in fact, most of the stories you can tell which have names associated are either of Indians who have been wounded or killed, or Indian troops who've been decorated. It's the ones in the middle. We don't know anything about them except in the general.
In general. Could you also lay the land in terms of the number of people who were part of the Indian Army, and if you could give us some figures and numbers to just give the broad spectrum of number of people who have lost their job, got wounded, lost their lives and everything.
Yeah. Modestly proud that until my book came out, we all thought that about 5,000 Indians had served on Gallipoli, because of a statistic in one of the War Office reports which said number of Indian troops sent to Gallipoli, 5,000. And everybody, including me, thought, it's 5,000. I always wondered about the figure because two brigades, an infantry brigade and an artillery brigade and supply and transport, seems to be more than 5,000. And sure enough it is. But when you get into the Indian National Archives, which is where the surviving records are held, and you start to tot up the numbers of troops that arrive and then reinforcements that are sent, it turns out there are actually about 16,000 Indians who served on Gallipoli. So that's about the third largest Empire contingent at Anzac. The Australians are the most, New Zealand is next, and the Indians third. Of those 16,000 odd Indians, about a quarter of them are Sikhs, because the Sikhs are in the 14th Sikhs and in the Mountain Artillery. About a quarter of them are Punjabi Muslims. The Indian Army called them Punjabi Muslimans. That was their sort of arcane terminology. And they're in the Mountain Artillery, 50-50. It's split equally between those two groups, and largely in the supply and transport. And then there are the Gurkhas. About half the force is Gurkha because of the four Gurkha battalions. There are odd men. I mentioned the medical officer of the 14th Sikhs was not British. He was a Parsi. Hurjat Parsaji, I've forgotten his name exactly.
That's terrible.
Fine. But anyway, a Parsi. And in the medical units, there were small medical units on Gallipoli. They had British medical officers and Indian orderlies and bearers. And lots of them are Hindus from places like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. So there's a mixture of Indians in the Indian force in those proportions. But you'll notice that there's no one from Bengal, there's no one from what was called Madras, there's almost no one from Bombay.
I was assuming, yes, I wanted to ask that.
This is very highly concentrated on certain parts of India. And that partly explains why Indians haven't been particularly interested in it, because why would a Bengali write about a force that had no Bengalis in it? It's not a Madras story, it's a Punjab story, and it's a Nepal story above all.
In terms of the gaps you see, the middle layer, which there is nothing not too much of evidence and not too much of tracking and then records found out. But as you have gone across multiple countries to navigate through the archives, what are the initial hints of evidence you would see that there was a middle layer which hasn't been talked about?
Yeah, this is the missing evidence that I couldn't find, and in fact there was no way I could find it, or if I did find it I couldn't use it because I don't speak any Indian language. I certainly don't read it. Most Indian troops were illiterate, but within each unit there were men who were literate, and they would write letters, and those letters would be sent back to their villages. And we know this because from the force in Egypt and in France, those letters were censored. And the censors, the British censors, who were mostly retired Indian officials, would transcribe the letters, and so they could see, they could gauge the morale, the feeling amongst Indian troops. And those letters are still in the National Archives in London, the transcriptions, and they were published. David Amissi did a whole book on them. The letters that were sent from Gallipoli, sadly, were not censored. So we don't know what the Indian letters from Gallipoli read. The letters were sent to villages in the Punjab and Nepal, possibly, and some of them may have survived. I say may because, as you know, as all Sikhs know, 1947 was a time of turmoil and destruction, and lots of those letters would have been lost as Sikh homes were burned and as possessions were piled into boxes and carried off for a new life. And what would a few letters matter, even if they'd survived? So it is possible that in Sikh homes there are letters that were written on behalf of Sikh soldiers on Gallipoli and reached their villages and were read out to the family and then were passed around the village and became sort of public property, because they would often mention their comrades' names. If the letters from France were any judge, they would not just write to their family about their experience, they would mention their comrades. So they were kind of communal property. But they weren't published. In Australia, for example, letters back home, first of all, were kept by the family. They were often then published in newspapers, so you can find a lot of them, and they're digitised now. And then they were often donated to libraries and archives, so you can easily find them. That's not the case in India. So it's possible that those letters exist. My friend and colleague Rana China in India has been looking for that sort of material for years, and he's probably found less than half a dozen sources. So if they are in family possession, they're very closely guarded. And it's such a shame and a paradox, because lots of Sikhs want to know about their forebears' history and war, and those letters would give us insights into not just those men, but their friends and their units' experience. But finding them will have to be the job of an Indian, of a Sikh or Punjabi speaking researcher who can gain the trust of those families and encourage them to let that material become public. And then we might know a bit more about what went on in the trenches of Gallipoli among Indian soldiers.
I want to go, when you initially talked about the role of Anzac Day, and then Gallipoli campaign in nation building, in the identity that we are Australians, we need it requires some blood. So in that blood, the blood is mixed with of multiple ethnicities. So what role do you see Nepalis and Sikhs playing in that nation building of Australia? Yeah,
that's a really good question, and it's become an important question in the last couple of decades, because in those years, Indians have now become one of the principal migrant groups. When I came to Australia in 1966, most migrants came from the British Isles. Well, now they don't. They come from all over the place, but they certainly come from India. And so Indians, not so much Nepalis. Nepalis, in researching the book, I never got any chance, I never was able to find Nepalese Australians who had a connection to this, possibly for one of the same reasons, that Gurkhas didn't come from all over Nepal, they came from particular places.
You're right.
And Kathmandu wasn't one of them. The cities weren't where they found Gurkha recruits. So presumably there aren't people in Australia who have links to those particular places. I also found it difficult to find Punjabi Muslims. They seem to be much more private and more ambivalent about their military service for the British, whereas Sikhs are proud and open and curious. So it's going to be the case, I think, that Sikhs especially see the service of Sikh soldiers on Gallipoli alongside the Anzacs as one of the ways in which they can claim a part of this Australian story. And we've seen it now for years, where Sikh groups will be a part of Anzac Day. Often Indian ex-service personnel who will march on Anzac Day representing the Sikhs who served alongside the Anzacs. And you see it in attendance at Anzac Day ceremonies. You see the Gurudwara in Western Sydney, which has now got a statue commemorating Sikh service on Gallipoli, making a connection between them, their relatively new Australian community, and this festival of Australianness. Wow. So I can see that that's a way in which, and Indians and Sikhs aren't the only ethnic groups to do it. Turkish migrants do it, of course. Greeks do it through Lemnos, the Greek island where they staged the invasion. All sorts of ethnic groups claim a connection. Maltese Australians, for example, point out that lots of the casualties from Gallipoli were taken to Malta and treated there, and so Malta hosted Australians in the First World War.
Wow.
So they're claiming a connection to Australianness through this Anzac connection.
Wow. And then just to add on, in Western Australia we have WA Sikh band, and then you talked about TJ. If you please elaborate on his story and what your research came out.
Yeah.
And he leads the band. He's part of the band.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah. Every year he does the part of the band.
That's great. That it bears out the importance of Sikh Australians feeling to make a connection to Anzac. That's an important connection, because I'm pretty sure I came across TJ Singh after the book came out. And one of the great frustrations of historians is that there's a well-known phenomenon, and there should be a name for it, that when a book comes out, you immediately get messages from people and you wish you'd been able to put their stories into the book, but they wouldn't have known about the book until it came out. And TJ Singh is a great example, where he wrote to say his grandfather, I think, was on Gallipoli with the 14th Sikhs, and he wanted to know more, of course, and there wasn't much more I could tell him because that's all I had, the name. But the point was that he's not the only Australian. When I went to Western Sydney, I was talking to the people in the Gurudwara about Indians on Gallipoli, and one of them stood up and said, my father was on Gallipoli, and sure enough, he had a photograph. He was a signaller, again in the 14th Sikhs. I had his name. He had spoken to his father about his father's memories, and he had a few memories. I was able to put that into the book.
Lovely.
So and I've had the same experience when I spoke to a Gurudwara in West London. So there are lots of people who've got these connections, and my hope is that one day somebody else will come along who has language, who has an insight into the culture, who has connections to the Sikh diaspora all over the world, but especially, of course, in India, and will be able to find new stuff. There actually is a colonel in the Indian Army who's publishing a book on Sikhs on Gallipoli this year.
Lovely.
I've forgotten his name, but the point is there is stuff being done. Now, I don't know what else he's found. I hope he has found new material, but even if he hasn't, even if he's gone through the existing archives, because the Indian National Archives has a lot of records, he'll have seen things that I won't see. Maybe because he's a soldier, maybe because he's a Sikh, but either way, his book will be published in India and will be available to Indians. I mean, my book was published in India too, but finding a book on Indians on Gallipoli in an Indian bookshop, unless you know it's there, is impossible.
No.
He will have the opportunity to promote, and I hope to sell his book to people who don't even know that they may have a connection to Gallipoli, who don't realise that they're part of this story because of the service of a great uncle or a great great uncle or a great grandfather.
And how has, within the Anzac format, how has the role of the Indian Army been recognised or commemorated in different ways and fashion? How do you see that? Yeah,
that's really important. There are several facets to that, Dev. One is that especially because of the Indian diaspora, the number of Indians and especially Sikhs in Britain has made the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which basically runs all the British Empire cemeteries for the World Wars. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has become acutely sensitive to the way in which Indians are commemorated. Basically, the British Indian Army went to a lot of trouble to observe the religious practices of its troops. So it would bury the ones that were buried, and it would burn the ones that were cremated. You know, it would attempt to do that. It would attempt to put the right inscriptions on headstones and things. But it became clear in the decades after the Great War, two things became clear. The first is that they missed Indians. One of the great boasts of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was that they would commemorate every single person, whether they had a grave or a name on a wall, everyone. Well, it turns out that's not the case for the Indians and non-European troops. That the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, to its great credit, has now gone back through military records and has started to find men who were killed or who died, but who aren't on cemetery lists and who don't have names on memorials. And it's rectifying that by revising those memorials. The other thing is that when this book was launched in 2015, a woman in the audience said, the Indian names aren't usually on memorials. And I said, oh, of course they are. Look at Gallipoli. I've been to Gallipoli. I've seen these names. They're on the memorials. And it's true. All of the Indian dead of Gallipoli are named on the Great Hellas War Memorial, alongside the British, alongside the Australians, New Zealanders. But that's not the case all over the world. If you go to Mesopotamia, to Iraq, there's an enormous memorial, which used to be at Baghdad, and now it's been shifted to Basra. And it's a big memorial because Mesopotamia was the main theatre for the Indian Army in the Great War. Tens of thousands of Indian names. But they're not names, they're numbers.
Oh.
A typical memorial plaque at Basra will say, memory of unit, British officers named, Indian officers named, and 353 Indian other ranks. They're not named. So that's something which we're now embarrassed about and should do something about. So Indian commemoration, the commemoration of Indians, is now become much more important than it used to be. And that they're also visible in memorials like the memorial in Western Sydney. In Britain, there are Sikh memorials that have been erected. So it's a sense in which it's a post-colonial thing, that rather than taking for granted that, of course, Indian soldiers don't need their names recorded, now they're being paid respect to individually.
Very powerful. Before we conclude, could you share some untold stories which you think have not been shared in many formats, and then something which you think should be told more often?
I wish I could. I wish I could tell more than I found. I wish I could say that there were so many stories, so many anecdotes, so much evidence. You know, I could leave the best of it on the cutting room floor. Actually, that's not the case. Conscious of this lack of Indian evidence, I wrung every possible drop I could get out of the Indian evidence. Every Indian name I could find, I made sure I mentioned. There are about 250 Indians named in the book, because I felt that was a way in which to pay respect to men who, for a century, why is it for us? It took 100 years. How many 100 books are there dealing with Australians on Gallipoli? There must be at least 500. It took a century for somebody to write a book about Indians on Gallipoli, and that was a white guy, a British migrant from Canberra, for goodness sake. Why is that the case? And it partly comes back to the ethnicity, that it's very specific. It comes back to the fact that the evidence is very hard to find. It's scattered all over the place. It's in Britain, British National Archives, it's in Indian National Archives. You have to go to a bit of trouble to find the stuff. So I think it's going to come down to somebody else, and I've got faith that one day somebody will stumble across a treasure trove of evidence. That Sikh communities especially, who are so conscious of their history, who are so proud of their military history, will go to the trouble to find this stuff. And it won't be me, but I hope somebody does it.
I'm so glad and so respect your work or what you have done, and to brought people who have lost their lives to life again in terms of remembering their names through your book. To conclude, what would your message for this year's Anzac Day?
I think a really important aspect of Anzac Day is to, and I don't mean this unkindly, but forget the rhetoric. Anzac Day is a day when people come together and talk in respectful terms about the fallen and honour and glory. Not so much glory these days, but people do tend to be very, very respectful on Anzac Day. And I think being respectful is clearly, I hope I've shown, this is one of the things that motivates me, but respect can get in the way of truth. And one of the things I think we need to be about history, and especially military history, is truthful.
Yeah.
So remembering not just the triumphs and the glories, and Gallipoli is a good example because Gallipoli was a defeat, but remembering the costs, the consequences for individuals, for communities, for nations. And for India, the cost of the Great War was 70-odd thousand dead. For Australia, it was 60,000. For Britain, it was 700,000. So, and multiply that for the wounded and the consequences for the survivors and their families. And when we remember that, I think people are maybe less inclined to talk in lofty terms about the glories of the dear fallen, and start to see war for what it is, which of course is a disgusting, appalling, and we know that because we see it on our television sets every night these days. We know that it's a nasty, horrible business, and that's, I think, the best way to remember them is to remember them truly.
Thank you. Thank you,
Very
Professor.
welcome, Dev. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.